So let's now implement those pages, those routes together. And for this, of course, we go to this pages folder, and in there we can add a new file. A new file for our root page, for our home page, so to say, the index.js file. This will then hold the component that should be loaded if we visit localhost or whatever our domain is /nothing. And therefore in here I'll add the homepage function, so a functional component which I simply name homepage. And of course we also want to export this as a default. We need to do that for Next.js to find that component. And then in there we return the JSX code that belongs to this component. And for the moment, I'll just return a div here with a h1 tag where I say the homepage. But in this course section, unlike in the last course section, we are also going to add more output and more logic to our application. So we'll not stick to such dummy output. But for the moment we will, and we will continue adding the other routes. Now we also need a route for all events, and then for that slug, so for consuming all dynamic segments, and for a single dynamic segment for a single event. Hence we can add an events.js file for our events page, which lists all events, or alternatively, instead of adding that file, we add an events folder in the pages folder, and in that folder, we then add an index.js file. And that's the exact equivalent to adding an events.js file. And I will go for this approach also because we'll need that folder later to set up nested routes for a single event, for example. Because keep in mind that for a single event, for that event detail page, I want to have /events/some dynamic segment. So for that nested route, like for all nested routes, we will need this subfolder, this events subfolder. Otherwise, we won't be able to set up such a route. Hence, we'll need that events folder anyways, and therefore we can already create it for the all events page as well. So in there we add another functional component, and I'll name it all events page. Of course, those names are up to you though. You can name your page components however you want, but I'll go with this name and then return another div here where I say all events. Again, that's just some dummy content. We'll replace that with actual output and some logic later. Now, two more routes, two more pages to go, and the first one will be the page for a single event. So when we selected an event for displaying all the detail information for this event. Now we want to select that event dynamically by ID, and therefore the page should have a dynamic segment in its URL, so in its path. And you learned how that works. We set up a file with square brackets in the file name, and then between the square brackets, any identifier of our choice. For example, ID, or simply event ID, whatever you want. And I'll go for event ID written like this, within capital I, so that I can then later extract that actual event ID from the router, from the query property as you learned it, by that key, so by using that key. And hence in this square bracket event ID file, we add the event detail page. And we of course also export that page, the event detail page. And then here for the moment, I'll also just return a div where I say event detail. Now the last page, the last route I want to add therefore is this slug route. So which consumes all segments, even if that would be multiple segments after, in this case, events, because I'll create it in the events subfolder. And for this, the syntax also is to use square brackets. But then we also add 3 dots, like the spread operator in JavaScript, or the REST parameters syntax from JavaScript. And then any identifier of our choice, for example, slug. But again, that's just something you will see quite a lot, slug, but you can of course use any identifier you want. Now you might think that this maybe clashes with the event ID, but as long as we enter more than one dynamic parameter after /events, it won't. And that's exactly how we're going to use that. If we just have /events/something, so just one segment after /events, then the slug will not kick in. Instead, this event ID route will then handle such a request or such a URL in the end, as you will see throughout this section. So therefore here in this slug file, I'll name this filtered events page, because here I want to show a list of filtered events, and then we can export this here as well. And of course in the component also return some dummy content here, filtered events like this. And I did spend a lot of time explaining this, but these are of course some key features of Next.js, so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page regarding them. Now with all of that, we can start the development server with npm run dev, and this will now start it up, and we can now open the browser and visit localhost 3000, and we see the home page. Now if we visit localhost 3000/events, we see the all events page. If I enter /events/ let's say E1 as a dummy event ID, I see the event detail page. And if we try out this slug concept and we try to filter for events that take place in 2021 and then May by adding the segments /2021/05 after events, I see the filtered events page. Of course, it will be our job throughout this section to make sure that on that filtered events page, we then extract the actual segment values from the URL and then find appropriate events. But that's exactly part of what we build throughout this section. And therefore with that, we now got the basic setup we need. Now we can gradually start filling that with life.